Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, man. I'm so excited to be here.
Likewise, and I would love to jump right in and get your thoughts on what do you think is the number one mistake that every man and woman makes that keeps them single and miserable?
Damn, I love that we're getting right into the hot topics. What is the number one mistake? I'd say that people aren't clear on what they actually desire, so they don't actually get explicit and write it down. When I'm working with someone and I'm like, all right, what do you want? They're like, well, I want this and I want this. You have to write it down because what happens is when we have a connection with someone and we're not clear about what we're actually looking for, we'll pursue the connection even if it doesn't fully match with what we ultimately desire, like an alignment with our values. So I'd say that, and then getting better at saying no to the wrong people faster. Like that's a skill everyone needs to learn, is like, how do we exit when it's not aligned? And some of us will take 20, 30, 40 years to do that. And so we actually just have to get much better at it.
And what do you think is like a good first step for somebody to prepare themselves so that they can avoid these mistakes?
Well, clarity. I mean, a lot of us don't do autopsies on our former relationships, and the reason that's so valuable to look at our past, we don't want to live there, but we do want to garner all the brilliance that comes from choosing the wrong people, showing up poorly in relationship ourselves. So I'd say getting really clear, writing out, what did you like about your past relationships? What did you not? What were the qualities of the partners you liked? What were the qualities you didn't? What were the qualities within yourself that need work? Unconsciously, a lot of us don't recognize that unconsciously we pursue people who tend to wound us in a similar way as a parent who wounded us the most. So usually we are unconsciously seeking to resolve something that wasn't resolved in our early childhood. So if like my dad was never around, I might be drawn to people who are long distance or unavailable or in relationships. And so it's just like what we're seeking to learn is that to stop chasing that wound being healed through relationship and actually choose ourselves and show up for ourselves, which would then make it so we don't orient a relationship from a place of wounding.
And you hear a lot about like the importance of working on the past, unhealing poor patterns that were developed when you were a child, maybe like healing from past relationships. But then you also hear the importance of like working on yourself to become that version of yourself that you want to become, whether that's self-confidence, whether that's getting in better shape, whether that's just having better boundaries, etc. Like, what do you think is more important for people to start with? Is it like the deep therapy work, or do you think it's important for people to like really address their self-confidence and get in great shape, work on the person they want to become and so on and so forth?
It's such a good question because I think what brings us to transformation is different for so many people. I think we equate change generally when we see someone hit a rock bottom. And we associate rock bottoms usually with drugs or alcohol or something like that. But it doesn't have to be. It could be an illness. It could be, going to jail. It could be lots of different things. And it's this recognition that, hey, I need to choose something differently. I got to become different. The interesting thing about change is we do live in a very therapeutic culture, right? That's like, we need to look at where does this come from? I've always thought like you don't actually have to know where a problem comes from to know that you need to change it. I think what's helpful about things like therapy and working with a good coach is that you realize it's not your fault. Like the patterns that you have are not your fault. They are perfectly designed to survive, to try to create safety, psychological safety, belonging. They're trying to do that for you and they often are working. That's why they exist. It's just that when you want to be in an adult relationship, skills that prevent you from getting hurt don't actually allow you to experience openness and love and vulnerability. So I think one of the pathways to creating self-worth is, of course, things like fitness. Because if I go for a walk or if that's all I'm capable of when I first start, I'm sending the message to myself that I matter. I'm experiencing immediately the benefits from a psychological perspective. If you, from a mental health perspective, let's just imagine you start with, I'm going to put out a boundary. Well, the first time you put out a boundary, it doesn't feel like you went for a run. It feels like your anxiety comes up, your world feels scary because now you're like, what happens if I lose this relationship? But what eventually happens is that because the boundary says, I matter. I matter enough to have a boundary. But if you've never felt like you mattered, the first time you do that is a terrifying leap. So if I lay a boundary, I'm saying I matter. I stand in the boundary. So now I have some evidence. I have like a baseline, a foundation of self worth. So boundaries have a symbiotic relationship with self worth. I lay the boundary. I love myself. I love myself. I lay more boundaries. So you could see how that's easy to cultivate from a place of nutrition and fitness because the feedback is so immediate. And so it doesn't really matter where you start. The point is that you start. But I see a lot of people will make their transformations will just begin in the place they have the most friction.
I look at it like this though. I think that like relationships, as you know, take so much work. They take a lot of discipline. They take getting comfortable, being uncomfortable. They take showing up when you don't want to. They take sacrifice. And I think fitness can be the ultimate catalyst for that because I just think your habits end up just transferring over in many ways to your relationship because you're like, okay, I've established discipline in this area of my life. So now I know what that looks like. I can do it in this area. I know the importance of showing up for myself and getting comfortable being uncomfortable. So I'm okay with that already. And again, I'm no relationship expert, but I think one of the problems I see is people get caught up in the rat race of working on their past so much that they don't even pursue dating or any kind of relationship because they're waiting to have this perfect like healing story. And I just don't think that necessarily exists because I think the way that you truly define how much you've grown is by are you making different decisions in the next time you're in a relationship, whether that's with a partner, whether that's saying no, etc. I mean, do you see that as a common problem now, given all the self-help advice that exists now?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the what you're speaking to is that if I believe something's wrong with me and that's how I begin my growth process, then that means that if I keep learning things on some level, the belief keeps being reinforced that there's something wrong with me. So a lot of us will orient to change from a place of low self-worth or shame even. We change because we feel ashamed. Shame isn't always bad. Shame can be a toxic place where we live. I'm broken, I'm not enough. It also, when it's healthy, is the recognition that there's a better choice available to us, a better version of us available. The thing is that eventually you have to become that version. So, if I start to orient to change instead of there's something wrong with me, I need to fix it, well, there's an opportunity for me. There's potential available to me. So, often what I navigate people through, which is exactly what you're saying, is orienting to my inadequacies, quote unquote, or challenges not from a place of evidence of my inadequacy, but actually evidence of what I'm capable of. One is the way a child sees itself, and the other one is the way an adult sees itself. So this is moving through a maturation process. And so, yeah, you're right, where there's like an obsession with personal growth. And that can be good as long as it's not reinforcing a belief of brokenness, which can happen a lot. And what you're saying about fitness, I mean, I love it because you do learn your discipline and you learn what's possible for you. I think what can be the trap of that side of things, which you're speaking to, is that it can also have a rigidity to it in that I know who I am. I know what I need to do to be disciplined and create a self. Well, our wounds are all created in relationship. So that's where they must be healed. So we bring this like full self to a relationship, but we still haven't learned compromise of our need versus another or someone's thoughts versus my thoughts. And so, as you're saying, like you get into a relationship and you still have to learn how to be a self in relationship. And so that's when the skills really get put to test. I would say that's like the hardest part is when your needs bump up against someone you love's needs and vice versa.
How do you get somebody to reframe that mindset of feeling like they're broken or they have something wrong with them, whether they're fresh out of a breakup, whether they're a few months out of the breakup, so that they can see it as an opportunity for deeper introspection and growth and not that they are just some failure in the dating world?
Well, I think one, we can't coddle people with how they showed up in a relationship. The first thing I do with people is we do an accurate audit of their relationship, who they chose, how they showed up, what was the person like? Because a lot of the times we have a hard time even owning the ways we didn't show up, the ways we behaved poorly, the ways like if you're in a relationship with someone, I hear this a lot. Like, why do I attract narcissists? Or why is this person this way? And I'm like, well, why are you a match for them? That's a better question because all we can manage is the common denominator. They're the evidence of a behavior pattern. And that's not to minimize someone's experience with a narcissist, but it's to say, like, we got to own our side of the street fully. So if you want to take a breakup and make it the most transformational time of your life, which it is certainly one of the most potent transformational possibilities, to me, I'm like, there's very few containers of transformation as powerful as heartbreak, because heartbreak will actually motivate us to change. We hear things like get a revenge body. And I'm like, yeah, sure. But like, get a revenge life, like, get a revenge soul, and like, use that revenge to change and transform. But at some point, you have to do it for yourself, not to get back at them or to get them back. Because if you make anything conditional on your transformation, if you don't get that thing, your transformation will disappear. So that changing of going from, we have to look at, like, if I orient myself as being broken, someone leaves me, someone ghosts me, and I make that about me, I'm still ego driven. It's like a different form of narcissism, right? Because it's still obsessed with the self. One is like an obvious obsession with the self. And I'm not saying people who suffer at the hands of a breakup are narcissists. It's that vulnerability and pain have a very self indulgent feeling to them. No one else will understand me. This always happens to me. And so we have this opportunity to see, like, it's only available, that perspective, if the perspective exists within us. So, like, if I believe I'm not enough and you leave me, what a gift. Because now I recognize that you left me and somehow my value is in you staying or leaving. Anything that leaves you and leaves you devastated gives you an opportunity to see that you place your value in it. And what a beautiful gift that is, painful, but a beautiful gift to recognize that no one can ever take your well-being. They can't.
And so would you say when you're doing this audit with people about why their relationship didn't work out, most of the time it comes back to, somebody not loving themselves enough, somebody not standing up for themselves, somebody not having a high level of self-worth, and because of that they attracted either a certain partner or they tolerated things that they shouldn't have tolerated?
Yeah, like, I want to make sure that people aren't conflating that the outcomes of their relationship are indication of some sort of character flaw or value flaw. It's that if someone betrays you, almost always you can track it back to betrayals that were internal. Like, cheating on the outside, usually you can look back and see where you betrayed yourself before that betrayal. So I would say by doing that audit, you get to see exactly what you said, what you're tolerating, what you're allowing, who you've become, where do you not share your voice, where do you not stand in your values. You can, I would say I want to say 100% of the time, but I know there's like someone who's like, not me. So 99.99999% of the time, you can actually go back and track many times you abandon yourself. That doesn't justify that anyone can behave poorly or hurt you, but it's to say, like, what behavior patterns do we participate in that create that? And I think one of the hardest patterns to even look at that, because it's so triggering, is looking at things like abuse. But on some level, there's learning in abuse. It doesn't mean, and I'm not saying there's learning in the experience of it. I'm saying there's learning in, where did we learn to tolerate that? Where did we learn to not stand up for ourselves? Where did someone teach us that? Where did we let it go too far? Where are we not resourced in our community? Like, all these types of questions that they're not absolute, but they at least lead us to a point of inquiry to recognize, oh my God, how do I learn from this? And how do I help others learn from this?
And so in talking about like abandoning ourselves, and in order to not abandon ourselves, we have to work on ourselves to build a level of self-confidence and self-esteem to become that person that doesn't do that. We talked about like the correlation between fitness and how that can transfer into relationships. Outside of that, like, what are some of the things that you recommend to people so that they can step into that next version of themselves, so that they stop abandoning themselves when they're dating people?
Self-worth is such an interesting concept because we talk about things like self-love. And self-love to me is, we often think of it like bubble baths and cold plunges, maybe, and all these other things, prioritizing of self. And ultimately, I think of self-love as being a, a group of rituals and habits, because I can make a choice in this very moment that says I love me, and I can make a choice in this very moment that says I don't. So, if I'm someone who has addiction issues and all of a sudden I choose to do cocaine tonight and I've committed to myself that I wouldn't, I'm not going to love myself. And that's not an indication of a flaw in who I am. It's that I still have work to do and my habits and rituals and choices are not aligned with my values. So, the fastest way to completely change how you feel about you and how you show up in your life is to set a standard and then be the standard. You know, anyone who really loves themselves is not going to tolerate someone who treats them poorly. And that's not to blame the person who tolerates someone who treats them poorly because they learned it somewhere, but it is the responsibility of the person to change their behaviors, to change their choices, and to change their outcomes. So your environment and your results you get in your relationships in your life are going to be reflective of how you feel about yourself. And when you don't get outcomes that you desire, it's not evidence of a failure, but of another opportunity to figure out how to do it differently. And I think anyone who's started it, that's why I think entrepreneurship is such a great personal growth project. Because like you literally the thing you're putting out there is the expression and manifestation of yourself. Oh, like if people don't like just post something about what you think on the internet, I promise you that whatever wound you have, there's a troll for it. It's like so true. I know you know this.
Yeah, for sure. And I think always people are always looking for answers, right? They're like, all right, I'm doing the work. I'm working on to becoming this highest version of myself. I'm working on boundaries. I'm working on my inner child. I'm working on habits, behaviors, all these things. But is there anything I can do when I'm in a relationship or I'm dating somebody to know that the relationship won't fall apart? I mean, a lot of people will say what breaks down relationships is loss of connection. And it's not something that happens overnight, it happens over time. What are your thoughts on what destroys relationships?
Well, not bringing the truth forward in the relationship. You're right. It's that buildup over time of self-silencing, of not speaking up, of not sharing what's coming up for us. I think because in our culture we've really demonized people if their relationship ends. So, we sort of treat people who are divorced. We're like, what's wrong with you? Why did you get divorced? You see people in dating profiles who don't want to date someone who's divorced. And what I think is so fascinating about that is the message is that I don't want to date or relate to people like that or become like that because they failed. And I'm like, well, if we were in a mature community and someone made a mistake, the community would say, teach us from your mistake because you learned something. And I find when a whole culture says divorce is bad and someone does it, I'm like, well, there's something actually kind of pioneering about that. Someone was willing to actually, and again, we're talking about like under the context, they left a relationship. They didn't like cheat and lie and do all these things. But that there is actually something about choosing oneself at the cost of being loved by the people around you. There's something really beautiful about witnessing that in someone. And so I think because we celebrate things like anniversaries, and if someone is married 75 years, we think that's better than someone who's married 10 years. So there's something about relational length that we say is indicative of relational success, which there is some truth to that. However, there are people who are married 75 years who hate each other. So we celebrate anniversaries, but we don't celebrate relational depth, which again shows you what the culture celebrates versus what is actually important. And the reason I say shaming people who get divorced, celebrating longevity over depth, why those are important on an unconscious level is because if I'm afraid that my relationship is going to end, I'm not going to have the conversations that might end it. But those are actually the very conversations that will deepen it. So I'd say relationships break down over time because people are not committed to the truth. They're committed to longevity at the cost of the truth. And that really is what leads to it, which is also that leads to self abandonment, which means that if you and I are in a relationship and we're not willing to tell each other the truth and really lay that down at the altar of our relationship, that means that we're in a relationship that requires that we lie, requires that we silence ourselves. Am I going to want to have sex with you if I blame you unconsciously for not being able to share how I truly feel? No, because I'm going to resent you. And so you see this sort of subtle, over time, resentment buildup in relational research. They call it contempt. And that is really hard to rescue a relationship from. But I'd say it's very normal for people not to fully express themselves because they don't have the skill set. Communication is a skill set, and listening is a skill set.
Right, and it's why we've talked a lot about working on yourself, because I think in order to be able to trust somebody else, you have to be able to trust yourself. And the way to build self-trust is to be consistent with your actions and to make sure that, what you do on a daily basis reflects the person you want to become and what you want in your life. But as far as like building trust and depth in a relationship, a lot of times it'll come back to, well, people think the only way for them to trust their partner is to know if they can open up to them when they're struggling or they're not happy in the relationship, which obviously is important. Are there other ways that you found that are maybe not so emotional that can help people build depth and trust in a relationship? So it's not always like during a moment of chaos.
Yeah, like just subtle habits that we can have in our relationship to fortify it. In in the research from the Gottmans, they talk about this positivity ratio. So they took couples who had just been married and they put them in these like a penthouse overlooking, I think it was Lake Washington. They called it the Love Lab, and they recorded their conversations. So you can imagine, like, you just got married, we're going to put you in this condo and listen to everything you have to say. And then they followed up in 6 years, and they looked at which couples were still married and which ones were divorced. And what they saw was that successful couples had above a 5-to-1 positive to negative interaction ratio. So below 5-to-1 divorce, above 5-to-1 relationship still together, 7-8-to-1 thriving relationship, 12-13-to-1 too much positivity that is not authentic anymore. Like, we know those people. It's like actually conflict avoidance. And so I always think about this, well, does that mean that relationships and successful relationships are actually like as simple as math, or not as simple as math? Because we know math ain't always so simple, but we just have to increase the amount of positivity we experience. And that's true. If you actually notice, if you just today start to commit to changing how many positive interactions you have in any relationships, not just romantic, you will notice a dramatic shift in the relationship. And there's that saying that what we appreciate appreciates. And so we we put these investments into the bank account of the relationship. And so what happens is that the balance is so high that over the long term we're actually able to navigate life's challenges because there's more insulation from it. And I really love that way of thinking about it, that yes, it is the big conversations that matter, how we navigate conflict, but it's actually the little things. And the Gottmans call it bids. There are these like little micro moments where we're trying to connect. And I think of one that my parents would do when I was growing up at the breakfast table. My dad would read the paper when people still do that. I don't even know.
My
But
grandparents too. Yeah.
yeah. And my dad would be like, huh. And then my mom would be like, oh, what are you reading? Or my wife, sometimes when she's reading something, I'll hear her be like, oh, I'm like, oh, what is it? That's a bid. She's making a bid. And so really successful couples turn to over, I think that in the research, it was like 87% of bids are positively returned. In couples that divorce, it's much lower, in the 30th percentile, somewhere around there.
That's crazy.
Isn't that nuts? I think it's just wild. Their research was made famous by Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, where he talks about how the Gottmans can listen to 20 hours, I think it is, of a couple conversating, dialoguing, like fighting, and predict with 94% accuracy if they'll divorce. And they can listen to just 3 minutes and predict with over 80% accuracy.
And it comes down to like the four horsemen, right? Isn't that what they call it?
Yeah, that's right. It comes down to what they call a soft startup. So, which is like how fights end is how they begin. So, we have to learn how to begin our conflicts softly. And yeah, the four horsemen: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Those are four behaviors that I would say everyone does. So, nothing to be ashamed of. It's rather, as I said, an opportunity to see how we handle conflict. And there's antidotes to all those four things. It's just that in couples that divorce, they're in really high quantity.
Going back to the positivity thing, because I think that can be overlooked. I think we talk so much about conflict, which is important. Maybe we'll get to that in a little bit. But like, do you think then it would be important to understand somebody's love languages or the way they like to receive love? Because positive to somebody could be positive to somebody else. If the love languages are true and somebody receives love by words, then a compliment would serve them well. Whereas if the other person receives love by acts of service, the compliment might not be as fulfilling. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. I mean, I remember working with this couple where she was like, "I just feel like you don't like share that you love me." And he's like, "Are you kidding me? I couldn't love you more. Like I drop you off at work every day." And she's like, "But you don't tell me." So exactly what you're saying, like he's an acts of service guy. So he's like dropping her off at work. He's having the best time. He thinks he's loving her the best she could ever be loved. And she's just missing it. And, they're kind of like just missing each other. And that's not a flaw of them. It's just that how they give and receive love is different, as you're talking about the five love languages by Gary Chapman. And gifts, acts of service, words of affirmation, time, that's right, quality time and physical touch. And we usually have a primary, and usually our primary is often the lowest one for our partner, which I think is really interesting how that works, because it's almost like the very thing we have the hardest time with is often the thing our partner needs. And we usually try to give love the way we receive it. So, for example, I have this friend who gives gifts all the time, like so many gifts. And I can just see that he loves through gifts and he wants me to give him gifts. And so we talk about it so he can recognize that, like, he wants me to do that. So he gives gifts because he wants to receive gifts. So we often do that is we'll like raise the bar on the thing we're doing so they'll finally notice and they'll get the hint. But the easiest thing is just do a quiz for free from the five love languages. I think it's fivelovelanguages.com, and you'll see each other's love language. I think it's fantastic opportunity to learn more about each other.
Totally. And like as far as um just things that you can do on a daily basis, I mean, do you think that like just scheduling time like throughout the day or throughout the course of a week, like going on, like I see people going on walks together to talk about their relationship. Do you think doing stuff like that can help like mitigate some of these bigger conflicts and fights that might arise?
Yeah, going for a walk when you're actually having a dialogue, like a conflict, it's really powerful because you're walking side by side, shoulder to shoulder, like facing the path. It's great on an unconscious level of what you're actually trying to do with the world, with your lives, and you're getting exercise. So you're taking down your threat response. Nervous system work is really important because it's the health of your connection will really be the result of the health of your nervous system. So adding things like meditation to your regimen to practice, because it turns that part between stimulation and response, it just gives you more time to make a better choice, to choose differently. Um, there's a couple practices that are really fascinating for couples to implement. One is my wife and I do it. It's two gratitudes and an appreciation. So the gratitudes are, what am I grateful for about life? Not each other, but life, and it can be each other. Um, and why? How did I create that? So obviously, if I say I'm grateful for the sunrise, I didn't create the sunrise, but I did create the time to appreciate the sunrise. And what that does is it unconsciously correlates that I am choosing these things. The appreciation is about the partner. What I appreciate about you is this, and here's why. Those are habits that really build beautiful insulation to the relationship, and we're keeping these positive interactions. There's another really interesting practice that I forget where I learned it, but it's to rate your partnership out of 10. So you're like, okay, well, what kind, now I'm a husband. I would have said boyfriend before. I'm just getting used to this. Like, out of 10, what kind of husband have I been this week? And, for some people, that can feel real scary, but we kind of play with it. It's like, she might be like, you were a 2. And I'm like, oh, frick, I'm a 2. But really, it's like, what would have made me a 10? Like, if she gave me a 7, I'm like, okay, like I can hear this. What would have made me a 10? And it gives me an opportunity to always learn how her needs are changing, because they are. My wife's need, everyone's needs are always changing. And what will meet, like, we have a new child. So what meets my wife's needs as a mother are very different than prior to having a kid. So it allows that changing of self. And it also is really just creating an environment of feedback. And that's actually really important, that the relationship is constantly giving you this opportunity to become better. And, when I was 21, I never thought oh, like my girlfriend has given me an opportunity to be better. Like now I can actually see that my wife or, my partners were always trying to make me better. I just didn't know how to hear it without feeling like I wasn't enough at the same time.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you genuinely rate yourself as a husband now?
Well, now that we have a kid, I'd say it dropped. It dropped. Would have said before, like I'm an 8 to a 9. I never give a 10 because then there's always room for improvement. But I said I was like a 8 to a 9. I'd say having a kid, I dropped to a 6, probably even at moments 5 because of the emotional depletion, like the tired. Not that I wasn't still a good partner, but you're both so tired that where you haven't done the work yet with some communication gets really obvious. Like before, when you have the emotional bandwidth to the willpower, uh, it's not as evident because you're like well slept, you're well nourished, you're well everything. But if you notice when people are depleted, that's when where the work really matters. And I was doing a podcast on this, just saying, like, oh my God, instead of orienting to that from a place of like, oh, I'm not enough. I can't believe I've let people down. It's like, I'm in the gym. Like, this is the gym. Don't waste this opportunity to see where my weaknesses are. And it's really offered me to see, like, oh, I still have more work to heal on defensiveness. I still have communication frictions that I need to work on, that we need to work on. And also, there's that postpartum, like, hormonal dysregulation that has an impact on the mother. And so just not taking that personally, also seeing that my wife has this like immense bond with our child, and then me feeling like I'm out, like the third. So being able to create space in the relationship to navigate all these things has been really beautiful. So I'd say I'd give myself a 6 to a 9 at times, but I'd say I'd spent more. My average was probably 7.
You strike me as somebody that's hyper self-aware now and very aware of your own tendencies, what you want to work on, what you're great at, what you're not so great at. Given what you just shared and that you want to maybe become less defensive, you want to work on your communication, you want to, take your husband rating up more consistently.
I like that.
Like what are some things that you're going to be implementing this year to work on that, either with yourself or with your partner or with your wife?
Such great questions. I'd say that one of the parts is when we aren't prioritizing ourselves as much, then that'll be reflective in how we show up in the relationship. And so now my gym regimen's back in full force. Like everything, my practices, my rituals are back in. Cold plunging and cold water exposure, I have to tell people, is really powerful for learning to observe your dysregulations so that because your body's like, you're going to die, you're going to die, you're going to die. And really, you're not going to die. So it allows you to separate the observation of your response from how you actually are, your actual level of safety. For me, I think, yeah, really dialing down the rituals and the habits. And then the other side of it is I've been playing with when you listen to someone like Eckhart Tolle or Byron Katie, they talk about their awakenings being these observations of their responses, but they are not them. Like Eckhart Tolle talks about like my pain body, and you're like, that must be so interesting to observe your biological response from such a detached place and then always choose love. And I think it's important to clarify for you listening that there's a difference between being compassionate about where a behavior comes from in someone and being tolerant of it. So I often hear this like, oh, it's not unconditionally loving to leave somebody. It's not unconditionally loving to hold a standard. And it's like, no, that's actually love. And I've been playing with this, like, how do I actually become more observant of my emotional responses so that I can choose the path as best I can, as many times as I can. And so I've been really playing with that where I notice more activation if I'm in a conversation with my wife or even something with work, let's say, for example, that I'm able to take a breath, really acknowledge that there's nothing urgent. How do I want to show up? What do I want to say in this moment that is changing me and changing our relationship? And so that's something I'm really like, that's at the forefront of my work now is how do I really navigate that?
There's a lot of roadblocks right now for you as far as a breakup. Like it's not like, I mean, you're married, you have a kid together, you're obviously a great guy, very self-aware, committed to working on yourself, so that the odds of you getting broken up with or divorced super quick or slim to none, right? But there's a lot of people that struggle with this thing where they're in a relationship with somebody, they know they need to work on certain things, and it's like, what's the timeline like to be able to know, like, all right, like, is this going to end up working out with somebody? Like, how much time should I ask for from my partner to hold the space and be compassionate to me, like working on some of these unhealthy patterns I might have? And then on the other side of that, like, how do you know if you're just being hyper tolerant? Like if somebody's, not really changing and it's been like 6 months. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh man, that's such a good question because that's so many people's lives. First off, each person gets to decide what the timeline is. Like, if I don't see this change in 3 months, 6 months, a year, I think with relationships that are longer, there's probably more insulation to that. Also, if there's been a built up level of credibility and trust and all that. But if your whole relationship has been spent with you chasing someone to change and they're never changing, it's a pretty good evidence that you need to change how you orient to people not changing, that it's actually your challenge now. Because usually what you see in relationship where one person wants another person to change, they've probably spent a lot of their lives wanting other people to change. So we want to like heal the pattern of chasing, heal the pattern of orienting to other people. You see this in codependency. It's like I'm trying to get them to read the book, them listen to the podcast, them, and it's like our addiction is trying to get people to change, to be enough for them, to like help them. And when you think about two adults meeting eye to eye, one adult says, "Hey, I noticed this about you. Here's what I need from you." And the other one grows up and changes, and you take turns doing that. And when someone says they're going to change, the first thing is to get agreements on what that looks like. So if I'm talking to my partner and she's working on something, you know, now our relationship is just so rock solid in the sense that we trust each other. When we say we're going to do something, we do it. There's plenty of evidence for that. So even when we say we choose each other, there's plenty of evidence that that's true. So our commitments are trustworthy. And we're not going to go anywhere because there's small deviations in, you know, our abilities or a skill set or something like that. We actually see our relationship as the place that we grow. We see our relationship and our partner as the wisdom, the person who's providing me with the wisdom for my transformation and also the support and space to do that and the accountability. So when someone says they're going to change and they don't, that feedback needs to be delivered. And at some point, a boundary has to have a consequence because boundaries without consequences are just suggestions. And so if we end up staying with or even giving commitments to people that we're going to change and we don't, we're eroding the trust of the relationship. And ultimately, we don't trust ourselves. And ultimately, our word is worth nothing. And we know that, and they know that. And so we might just keep swimming in the shame of that and keep doubling down on that. We might cheat, we might leave, we might do something instead of changing.
You see, a lot of times you see people, they go into dating or into a relationship and they've got everything together. They're like, I know what I want, I know what I need. And they meet the person and the chemistry's great, their attraction's great, things are moving quick, and then their values seem to go out the door. Like, you're like, I'm not going to date somebody who doesn't like ice cream, and then the person doesn't like ice cream, but you're like attracted to them. You're like, you know what, they're cool, we get along well. And then the person's like, I don't like and the person's like, I'm not going to settle for somebody who doesn't want to travel the world with me. And the other person like doesn't like to travel, and they're like, well, we have great chemistry and we're getting along well, so they'll come around. Like, what is it about love that is so like overwhelming that it forces us to get lost in it and lose our sense of self the minute we're attracted to somebody?
I think that's when we're orienting to relationship from a pretty scarce place. Because, as I said at the very beginning, it's like if you're not clear on what you want, you'll take what isn't. You'll just take fleeting connection. But that's also this idea that connection is scarce. Connection isn't scarce, but if we're drawn to someone who, there's this really interesting study that points to exactly what you're talking about, where they had people write down everything they wanted and then they speed dated. and then they ended up with matches with people who were not what they wanted, but they had chemistry with. So they like throw out the lists they just created because of connection. So that points right to the origin that we're willing to abandon what we truly desire in for connection. So I'm placing connection with someone else ahead of the sacred love and connection to myself. So if I have to leave my center to choose you, you're not a good choice for me. But if I learned growing up that it was connection above everything, connection to my dad, connection to my mom, sacrifice self, then as an adult, I'll continue to play that out. So when love came with those kind of conditions as a kid, love will exist with those kind of conditions as an adult, thinking that's just normal. That's not normal. Sorry, that might be normal, but that's not healthy.
And our mutual friend Jillian Turecki, she was on the she's been on the podcast a couple of times, as people know, and I think she said something like, it was something we to the effect of, I don't know how it got brought up, but what I'll say is that chemistry, people always go off of chemistry, right? And they're like, if I have chemistry with this person, that means the relationship's going to work out. But she said something like, well, if chemistry like leads you down a path of destruction, I don't remember her exact words, but it was something to that effect, then chemistry isn't like a good sign for you, whether or not a relationship's going to work out. Because if you click with somebody super fast and you completely bypass a lot of the other things and the relationship falls apart, like then chemistry really isn't a good sign of whether or not that person's the right fit for you.
Yeah, and I would argue that if you have chemistry with people who aren't good for you, then it's not chemistry you're sensing, it's wounding. Because chemistry that's about goodness and like moving you towards healthy relating would never be with someone who's unhealthy. Like if you think about it, just from a rational perspective, like a healthy adult is not going to get involved with someone who lies all the time and isn't an addict. But if I'm conditioned to still have an attraction to someone who's inconsistent, who's not showing up, as I said earlier, it's like unconsciously we're drawn to people who continue to wound us till we learn how to move through that wound. It is honestly, when people learn that, it's like one question people can just ask themselves: what I wanted most as a child and didn't get was, the answer to that is usually what you long for and you're attracted to.
And so how do we know that's what's coming up as we're dating people? Is it that we're having chemistry with these people that don't treat us right?
Yeah, if you just look at, usually the answer to that question for people is something like understanding, to be a priority, to feel important, to feel safe, to feel loved, to feel like I was enough. So usually our triggers in relationship, the things that really cause us to get reactive in conflict, it's usually because that wound is being touched. I'm feeling not important. I'm feeling not understood. I'm feeling not safe. So you just have to look at your relationship patterns and you'll see that the majority of the significant relationships in your life, you usually have one thing you're trying to get that you're not getting. And so usually the healing of that is to give it to yourself. And what would that mean to, if I was fully understanding myself, what is trying to be understood through me? If I really loved myself, what would I do? If I really understood myself, I really prioritized myself. Like my main wound was my partner doesn't choose me, which if you look at the origin of that, it's like I'm not important. So then I just had to it was a lot more than that, but it's like I had to look, where do I not choose myself? Oh my God, the list was long. And so it's like knock out everything on that list, consistently live that list. Now what?
Human beings are great at rationalizing behavior. They're great at rationalizing thoughts in our mind. And a lot of times people will say they're ready to date and that they are secure with themselves. They have a high level of self-worth. They've worked on their past. And yet that's just a byproduct of them rationalizing so that they can start dating again and trying to get into a relationship. Have you found any effective ways with either people that you've coached or even you yourself to know like whether or not someone's actually ready to begin dating somebody again?
Yeah, again, such a great question because I think we sometimes say we're not ready just because we're afraid. So, whenever I think of someone going to the edge of what they know to be true or change, I always think of work because it's such an easier way to tap into like how your body feels. So if I said to someone, hey, you get offered another job. The job is kind of the same. It's not a pay raise. It's a lateral move. How does it feel in your body? People are like, "Mm, you know, imagine getting offered another job. You have no idea how to do it. The pay is significantly more. You know you got to do it. Like, how does that feel in your body?" And it's like, oh, well, it feels exciting. Feels scary though. And it's like just transfer that same type of question to relating. It's like, I know I need to step out. I know I got to try it. But I don't want to. So sometimes we date or go from relationship to relationship as a means of escape from being with ourselves. And I'd say for almost everybody, it's always a good idea to create sort of a container of healing where you're not relating in any way. And that allows you to explore the pulls that you get to random texts, to like sexualizing yourself, to Tinder, to one night stands, to friends with benefits, to just trying to get someone to notice you. You start to really pay attention to all these nuances and you can start to heal. You can start to be in full control of, the idea of, I worked with this one trainer once. He talked about it like taking charge of your charge. And I love that idea of like actually being in charge of where your chemistry goes, of what you're drawn towards. So, I'll often share with people like if you don't have full access to saying no around dating, relating, one night stands, even not texting someone, then your yes is actually not fully authentic. It's not fully grounded because it always comes with that caveat that under certain circumstances, you don't say no.
We talked a few minutes ago about like creating some sort of a timeline with holding space for somebody to work on themselves and working on things that maybe you're not essentially happy with them for when it comes to the relationship. Um, and I think there's also the idea that relationships are in many ways sunshines and rainbows, and it's like Hallmark movies, which we obviously know is not the case. When outside of abuse, like when does somebody know? Like, how can somebody know when it's actually time to walk away?
I think for everybody, that answer is going to be, different and also an exploration because, there's a great book called Too Good to Leave, Too Bad to Stay. And that question really navigates a bunch of explorations, this is a therapist who wrote it, who talks about like in her clinical experience and what does the data say. What I noticed for me is like one of the big questions to ask people is abandoning yourself staying or going? Because a lot of people get stuck in relationships and never leave them. And it's because there's something about how they are perceived and what they've been taught about relationship endings that they don't want to step towards. So they'll stay in these ambivalent states. We could be reliving childhood patterns where we're with people who are uncertain about us. And so it presents as they're uncertain about us, but really it might also be that we're uncertain about them, but it's being projected onto them. So I think just the exploration of should I stay or go is really just such a beautiful and very hard path to navigate. And you have to be open to hearing an answer you don't want. Because I will notice people searching their whole life for the answer to be anything but what it is. And I remember Carolyn Mace saying that we ask for a message from God and then we get it and pretend we didn't hear it. And so I think there's a truth to that that's like we like know in our bones a lot of the time. Another question in that book that I really liked was if my partner changed everything, would I want them? You know? And also there's another inquiry in that, which is like, do I just know on a deep level that I don't respect them? I don't share the values they have. There's too much pain here. I don't want to work through it. All these are just really important questions to ask. But at the end of the day, we talked about like what is ultimately what creates really powerful long-term relationships, but relationships in general, friendships, everything is a commitment to the truth. And if you have to begin any inquiry by telling the truth of how you currently feel and not being afraid of that. Because if you're afraid of the truth saying you have to leave, then you're going to avoid it. and it's going to live in your bones. You're going to feel it in your body. I think it's a large reason why people start to get sick. They get anxiety, they get depression, and it's because they're not listening.
What are some of the biggest mistakes people make, like post breakup, that end up keeping them miserable, single, etc.?
Staying in contact and marinating over the past, for sure.
Outside of the audit for the relationship, like, is there any other questions or self-discovery work you would have somebody do to help them, find themselves again?
Prioritize healing over everything. And if your breakup is the reason you finally do that, maybe for the first time in your life, it's absolutely necessary. So stop following them. Stop. If you need to, block them. If it's safe to do so, tell them that you're not going to be following their stuff anymore. You're going to mute them. You're going to do whatever. Create a time of no contact. The other thing I see people do is they don't actually end it. They still allow people to be their friend. A lot of the time, the people who end it want to stay friends because they feel ashamed for how they hurt someone. So they're like, we can be friends. And the other person is compromising themselves. So they're like, I really want more, but I'll accept friendship. We have to get very clear. They're not your friend right now. They're your past partner. They don't want to be in a relationship with you anymore. And so you actually have to own that truth. If that's true, what are you going to do with your life? Like, if you really want partnership in the future, how are you going to get there? It's not going to be marinating and waiting for someone to choose you. It's going to be choosing yourself. My wife and I, we've been together for 8 years. We were together 5 years and then broke up for a year. And in that year, our relationship was over. Like, it was over. The relationship ended. We loved each other and we just couldn't make it work. And so we chose to end that relationship. And we get asked a lot, like, how do I get back together with my ex? And my answer is always, you never should have to go backwards. You should meet your partner, whether it's your ex or not, as you move forward in your growth and healing. And I promise you, if your life is committed to that, you won't care if it's them. It's nice if it's them, if that's what you want, but it can't be focused on them. It has to be focused on you and creating the type of relationship you want and what you're going to tolerate and what kind of life you want to create. That's why you see so many people pursue their dreams when their relationship ends. And then they find someone while they're pursuing what they dream about. Well, of course, people are attracted to people who are pursuing what they love. And you meet other people who are pursuing what they love. That sounds way better.
Why do you think people cheat?
Oh, you go right with that one, eh? Right deep into that. I think people cheat for a number of reasons. One, because they don't know how to leave. So they cheat because they know they are burning a bridge and can't go back. And they know that likely the person will leave them. Two, because they don't know how to actually turn towards their partner and receive real feedback. So their partner tells them that they're not showing up and they're not great and they're not doing a good job. And they find connection from other people who affirm them, love them, are attracted to them. People cheat because, they're seeking connection. And we villainize the cheater, I would say, 100% of the time, right? But the cheater isn't always the villain. I think there's two parts to this. One is that you have the serial cheating, lying narcissist. That's a very different case. That's someone who just has such low self-worth and just doesn't treat people with value. They discard people. They just use them. And that person, their healing requires some deep, deep, deep work that likely you don't want to stick around for, because that requires a lot of humility and a lot of ownership and a lot of responsibility and a lot of accountability and a lot of repair. A lot of those people don't have access to the humility and the space to experience the shame that is actually trying to flood their body. So they would likely have low capacity, if any capacity, for shame. And really, we're talking about narcissism. But then you have the person who doesn't know how to leave. You have the person whose needs weren't met. There's that saying that you don't have to leave a relationship to leave a relationship. So sometimes someone will completely starve the relationship of intimacy and unconsciously try to force the other person to leave them. And then the other person will cheat. And then now this person will be the victim of the other person's infidelity. Again, I want to be mindful that there's a lot of complexity to infidelity, and everything I said probably triggered someone. But that's why it's just important that there's nuance around it. But there is relational dysfunction that can lead to infidelity. And if you are someone who cheats, there's an opportunity to recognize why you do it. And and if you're someone who cheated to leave, what a good opportunity to recognize why you did that. That you weren't allowed to just choose to leave. And now you can choose to leave. You don't have to burn your life down.
Do you think it's possible to come back and like repair a relationship after infidelity?
100%. Yeah, for sure. It requires both people wanting to. And it requires, I would say it would be very important that you get a therapist or a coach who's skilled at working through infidelity. Um, Gottman trained coaches, I know, look at that. The Imago trained coaches and therapists look at that. You want someone who works strictly on that. Now, the thing is, both people have to want to, and the person who was cheated on has to create the standards that need to occur for healing. And the other person has to agree to it or not. They might be like, I want access to your phone. I want to read everything you say, and I want you to end that connection that you had. And I want to see it done. And I want to have a conversation with the person. Like they can have all these different conditions for what healing will look like. And it's an opportunity for the person who was cheated on to stand in their power and what they desire and stop tolerating BS if that's been the pattern. And also look for where did they betray themselves, right? Look for where they haven't stood up for themselves. Did they want to leave the relationship? Have they betrayed themselves? And the other person has to atone. And that's saying, I'm sorry. I know I hurt you. And that might be a long atonement. And it might come up a couple of years later, and it just is another opportunity to atone. We don't want to create a pattern in the relationship where the person who was cheated on weaponizes that for the rest of their lives as a power move. But there definitely needs to be a space of healing. And I've seen couples do that and be better than they've ever been because they both healed deep patterns they didn't recognize.
This has been an amazing conversation. I think people are going to get an immense amount of value out of this. So Mark, I wanted to thank you for coming on. If people want to connect with you, if they want to buy, I know you got a book coming out in a few months that you wrote with, I believe, your wife. And so if they want to buy that, if they want to listen to the podcast, if they want to follow you on social media, where's the best place to do that?
So you can follow me at all the places at Create the Love and the Mark Groves podcast. And also our book is called Liberated Love, and it's available for pre-order. You can get that at our websites. Like my wife's name is Kylie Macbeth, and you can get it at liberated-love.com. Doug, thanks so much for having me, man. Appreciate it.
You got it, man. This has been awesome. Again, I think the audience is going to really enjoy this one. So thanks again for coming on. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.